Lead us off, Elizabeth.
Okay, good morning, good morning everybody, and I'll just turn it right over to Chris Callahan, who's the Director of NECAFs, to give an introduction.
Hey folks, Chris Callahan with UVM Extension. Welcome to the June NECAFs webinar. We're thrilled to have Luke Laborde and Jeff Stoltzfus join us from Penn State University and walk us through some of their work focused on food safety education programs with plain sect communities and other smaller produce growers. This was a topic that was actually identified very early in our proposal and center development planning as something that really would have quite a bit of regional relevance, particularly in Pennsylvania and New York state, and we're glad to be circling back on that. And one of just wanted to remind everybody that one of the key objectives of NECAFs is to develop this sort of add-on and supplemental educational material to focus on delivery and support of small, medium-sized growers in underserved communities. So I think that was all I wanted to say, Elizabeth.
Okay, great, thanks. So with that, we'll just turn it over to Luke Laborde, who has control of the screen, and you can start with your presentation, Luke.
Great, thanks a lot. Today we're going to talk about developing food safety curricular materials in the context of the Food Safety Modernization Act Produce Safety Rule. And what we're going to do is introduce ourselves first, myself, Luke Laborde, and Jeff Stoltzfus. Then we're going to talk about what we know about Amish growers and what educational approaches have been are out in the literature. What we, in particular Jeff, knows, real life experiences. Then we're going to talk about our project here, where we're at in the process, and we are still in the beginning phases. Then we really are interested in soliciting some feedback from people. I know there's lots of people out there with expertise and interest in this, and we want to gather as much feedback as we can. So with that, I'll just introduce myself, Luke Laborde. I'm an Associate Professor of Food Science, Extension Specialist at Penn State Food Science. I have a predominant extension appointment, but do research in tracking Listeria monocytogenes in packing houses right now, and extension activities with developing curricular materials for food safety and sanitation for ag producers, packers, and processors of fresh produce and mushrooms. Lead instructor for preventive controls for Preventive Controls for Human Food Alliance curriculum, and lead trainer for Produce Safety Alliance curriculum. And that's my contact information, or if you want to find me, just Google Luke Laborde and skip all the ones in Louisiana and just go to the ones at Penn State. And then, Jeff, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Okay, thanks, Luke. Yeah, I've been working in doing extension work in one way or another for the past 30 years in Lancaster County. A few of those years with Penn State, most of those years with a school district in eastern Lancaster County as an adult ag instructor, essentially an extension agent. And in that area, probably 90% of the farmers that I worked with were plain sect growers. And so over those years, we worked on a little bit of everything: pesticide ed, crop production, food safety were kind of the focuses of that program. Moved back here to Penn State in 2016 as a statewide food safety educator. For the past 6 years, I've been part of a food safety education team in the Plain community, and I'll talk a little bit about that later in the presentation. But we've also been doing FSMA trainings this past winter. I've done 5 or 6 or 7 in Pennsylvania and New York this past winter, so we're gearing up on the FSMA end of that as well.
All right. Just to get some background, and I know we're all aware of this, but let's go through this again. And the produce safety rule, which is Part 112 standards for growing, harvesting, packing, and holding of produce for human consumption. There's subpart C within there, and that's relating to personal qualifications and training in those sections 112.22 and 23. And so it gives some pretty explicit requirements that all personnel who handle covered produce or food contact surfaces or supervise thereof must receive adequate training. And they also mention have a combination of education, training, and experience in food safety. And they do say that it should be conducted in a manner that's easily understood and repeated as necessary. So they do give some topics: the food hygiene, food safety, health and personal hygiene, when recognizing when produce must not be harvested, some issues on inspecting containers and correcting or having a mechanism in place for correcting or reporting problems. We also know that there's the part about that one supervisor, at least one supervisor or responsible party must complete the food safety training that is a standardized curriculum recognized as adequate by FDA. And this is the PSA curriculum that is now currently being used. And that consists of essentially a grower manual, which many of you have seen, a 3-ring binder type situation, and also a slide set, a PowerPoint slide set. So our focus then is that if there's a situation where we are not, it wouldn't be to show high technology slides, PowerPoints, computers, slides, then what would be an alternative mode of delivery? Not an alternative curriculum, but a different mode. So I thought I'd start out just doing the academic due diligence and just going over some of what we've collected about the Amish in the U.S. With respect to agricultural education. There isn't a whole lot, but there's some very interesting things. Just starting off in 2009 when the Bodrow, Jepson, and Dellinger took a survey of plain sect growers who market produce in Ohio, and they came up with these characteristics. Now this is 2009. I don't know how out of date. We'll let Jeff correct us later, but typical plain sect produce farmers, white, male, aged 30 to 49, and farming is their primary occupation. 94% have less than a 12th grade education, and 84% at that time did not belong to any farm organization. And that almost 2/3 of their income was generated through produce sales, so very heavily into produce. And this is the farm sales that they gave at the time. Of course, these are out of date, being 8 years ago, but you can see they're primarily smaller operations when we look at the total array of sales outputs, that, especially in terms of the Food Safety Modernization Act coverage and exemptions. Again, Bodrow and et al. Reported on agricultural safety training for Amish youth in Ohio, and he gave some good tips that I think we're aware, but it's good to have this stuff documented and put down. That they emphasize local support from the Amish community was crucial. That you can't just go in there and set something up. You have to engage in the planning and delivery. And they made observations and found that the cultural norm was for not that everybody speaks up and has an opinion, but there is an individual usually who acts as a spokesperson, and that discussions and focus groups were effective, and more so than written evaluations for drawing out individual opinions. And they emphasized patience and sensitivity to cultural traditions were very important to the success of their project. Again, that was agricultural safety, farm safety, not farm food safety. Then Bergeford on extension needs of produce auctions, farmers again in general, interpersonal teaching methods. Very important to have people's specific questions answered and to draw that out. And they observed that most of the farms were family-run organizations. And there was some separation of duties, the wife and the children accomplishing most of the growing chores, while the men tend to focus on livestock and poultry, care and milking of cows and machine shop work. They noticed that it was primarily the men who attended the training, and so they sought ways to encourage attendance by women so that they understood the material presented. Then in 2012, some material coming out of Ohio State. This was Ohio GAP, Farm Food Safety Training for plain sect audiences. And they kind of similar to what was observed before. The care was needed to make these messages very clear and to avoid incorrect interpretation of material. So it applies to everybody, but they emphasized that. And it was necessary to work through the plain sect community to reach growers and to plan and just as mentioned earlier, to get that input and facilitate that communication. Then they brought up the low technology methods was often necessary because of the cultural norms among some, not all, that forbade the use of computer presentations. And then again, Parker, Wilson, Lejeune, and Duhan talked about developing programs in this area, and that this one-size-fits-all approach was discouraged, which makes us think, well, we have a one-size-fits-all curriculum right now, the certification curriculum. How one size does not fit all, how do we reach this individual audience here? The farm structure and operator characteristics influence decision-making, and that individual farm problems needed to be identified. So they have to get very specific. Finally, just last year, there was a very nice article, a very thorough article from Parker, Schlegel, Duhan, and Lejeune on barriers to gap implementation through Amish growers in Ohio. Again, being aware, cautioning technical extension and technical service people that they should be mindful of local trust and comfort levels among the audience, and that it was important and to rely on gatekeepers, they call them, for guidance and assistance. So you need a connection, someone who can speak for the community or a group that can speak for the community to build that program trust. They mentioned also, and we're going to go into this as well, the auction houses. Produce auction houses are really an important means of communication, and they are different than perhaps what we see in other produce areas, because they said there was a less uneven power dynamic as far as the social networks develop. So you're not dealing with a big corporate buyer who says do it this way, and they like it or not, I'm not going to buy or not going to do anything. No, these are more even power structure, so you could get more effective communication and ultimately compliance and a successful program. And this is just a little small portion of what they mentioned, and I encourage people to read this, and I can send out my references later at some point. Now, one thing I'll add is something we have done here at Penn State. We were trying to answer some questions regarding the produce safety rule, and there isn't an easy way to find produce growers, a direct way. So we thought we would put together a survey and try different ways to reach people, different audiences. We were primarily interested in coverage issues. Do they grow covered crops? Would they be doing covered activities? Exemptions, how would they fall into those qualified exemptions? Also some information about preferred information delivery methods and products that would help them meet the needs regarding farm food safety. This was not just Amish. We had 3 different populations surveyed. One was Amish growers, and this is, Jeff delivered this at some of the meetings he mentioned. Not certification meetings, but just grower meetings. We also had the same survey done at passed out at the Hershey Mid-Atlantic Fruit and Vegetable Convention, which is held every year in Hershey, Pennsylvania. So that's another 250 in addition to the 112 Amish growers. Now we also presented this survey before we started 3 of our 5 FSMA produce safety certification workshops for 109 growers. So we had different, we could divide up this into 3 general populations. So just briefly, a few of our results. We looked at compliance dates just to get an idea of you know, where we stand with respect to when there actually would be covered. And we can ignore the ag water deadline, I guess, for now, or perhaps that's going to be extended. But in general, we have the 3 business categories. They're very small, 25 to 250,000, the small 250 to 500,000, and others, the larger, more than $500,000 in produce sales. And that with each of the compliance deadlines. And so we can summarize the data as the total aggregate data and then split it among the Amish, the public, which is again the Mid-Atlantic Fruit and Vegetable Convention, and also some responses from an internet survey that we passed or we communicated to people, and our FSMA course attendees, our produce safety course certification attendees. In general, we're seeing a total of about 63% would be growing covered crops, and their activities would be covered. In other words, they're over 25,000. In general, or I should, no, I'm sorry, we're putting them into groups here. 63%, almost 2/3 would be very small. And striking that the Amish were a higher level of very small growers. The public and the FSMA course attendees, about half would fall in that category. So they have the longest amount of time to get up to speed, although of course many are already doing this right now. And then not huge differences overall. So again, we're seeing a lot of very small growers out there in each of those 3 categories. We go back a little bit and talk about, well, who's covered? What percent are covered? And again, coverage being over $25,000 in produce sales and growing covered crops, which would be intended to or likely to be eaten raw. So 71% overall would be covered. And that was kind of interesting. That's a large amount. But even more interesting is that not much difference between our 3 populations. The Amish are right up there, growing, you know, being subject to this rule. More so in the FSMA course attendees, which maybe makes sense because they knew they would be covered, and so they're attending the course, but not huge differences there. Then we applied the formula for qualified exemptions being 500,000 or less in total food sales. And again, about half would be eligible for a qualified exemption. And we could split that up, and we asked, okay, there's basically 2 kinds of qualified exemptions. If you majority of direct consumer sales, farmers market or farm stand or something like that, or direct to retail and food service sales within that location limit. And it's split pretty much, most of them are, we see a lot of direct sales to consumers, less so to direct and retail. And again, this is their perception. These are kind of complicated things to figure out. total food sales versus total produce sales. But it looks like a lot of people are going to be affected. Okay. So we asked, okay, guys, how do you feel about your knowledge of this produce safety rule? And I think this is what we would expect in general. If you just look at those that have good to very good understanding, or they reported good to very good, only, what, 25, 27, and 37% said they were comfortably, had a good or very good understanding. So there's a lot of work to do to get, obviously, to get information out, either through certification courses or other ways. A lot of, big on the fair, which to me means, maybe I understand, maybe I don't. So we asked them about their preferred sources for obtaining information on FSMA produce safety standards. Again, and we have some choices and asked them to fill in as well. And the extension program came up on top quite a bit, for 70% in general, and 82, 59, and 86 for those attending, or those are the three categories. Then the Department of Agriculture was second, and it's probably, you probably could extrapolate this to other states as extension and Department of Agriculture are government agencies that they interact with. Should be noted that the produce auctions were predominant, would actually be the second source of information on FSMA produce safety standards. So this shows that the produce auctions, it confirms that produce auctions are a communication hub, not just for distributing your products, but also for getting information. And so that implies some strategies for delivering information to growers. Now, there isn't much reliance on industry or trade associations or trade publications. They want this kind of extension, government to some extent, less so with the Amish, which we could predict, and less so with our other wholesale or our wholesale produce buyers. Then we asked about, well, okay, preferred methods for learning about farm food safety and FSMA produce safety standards and specifically. Still quite a lot of reliance on in-person individual meetings, classroom-style workshops, which is expected. If we look at down below the more high-tech options, I think everybody lists them as lowest, which is a caution when we develop materials in general for farm food safety, but particularly striking and not unexpected, the Amish would have not really rely on these kind of venues for getting information out. They like in-person, the Amish in particular like the in-person individual meetings and on-farm workshops. We've done some on-farm activities that many others have done as well for mock audits regarding audits, and I'm sure we'll be expanding that to mock inspections when FDA gets up to speed on their program. Now I'll let Jeff talk about attributes of the Plain community and some of his observations.
Okay, thanks, Luke. Yeah, just a slide here on the demographics. The states there in black are states that don't have significant Plain community settlements. You can see they're predominantly Ohio, Pennsylvania, and throughout, well, New York and the Midwest. But they are scattered throughout the country, but predominantly through New York, Pennsylvania, and the Midwest. You still have the slide control there, Luke. Yep. And this is another slide, just kind of shows the same thing. There's a smattering of communities all throughout. They continue to expand to look for new areas that suit them agriculturally. So we continue to see migrations out of Pennsylvania and out of Ohio, which are the two major states. Okay, next slide. So there's a lot of diversity in the when we say Amish. That's why I prefer the term plain sect. There's 40 distinct different groups of Amish and Plain Mennonites in North America. So if you have Amish in your community, you may have an idea of what Amish do or how they respond in certain situations. But there are these groups do vary a lot in their dress, in how they dress, some of their practices, whether or not they use tractors or horses or steel wheel tractors or electricity, and in their use and acceptance of technology. Some of them don't mind using technology, others it tends to be more of an issue. The thing that they have in common, so if they have so many things different, what is it that makes them, what is it that they have in common? They have obviously a theology that's basically the same. But I think the other thing that you'll find in all of these plain groups is an emphasis on family and community. When we think of family, we think of holidays, Thanksgiving, Christmas, Easter, and you think of community, you think of parades and 4th of July activities or Memorial Day activities. These folks kind of weave family and community into every day, into their business, their social, their private lives. Community and family are important in all of that. So it changes the dynamic a little bit. Next slide. So as we mentioned, there's auctions, produce auctions in, well, it all started probably back in the mid-'80s with a produce auction here in Leola, Pennsylvania. That was organized, operated by a group of Plain community farmers, and it's kind of grown, and that model has been replicated 100 times now throughout the Midwest and into Canada. These auctions vary in sales from 200,000 on some of the smaller ones to as much as 15 million or more in some of the bigger auctions. And they seem to thrive well in plain communities where you have growers that are committed to produce, where you have a suitable market, and that's probably why the sales vary so much. Some of these communities just don't have the market for $15 million worth of produce, but some other areas do. So that's kind of been what's driven them. They serve between 100 and 1,000 growers each. Some of the bigger ones will write checks to sometimes as many as 2,000 different addresses each year. Some of those growers are garden surplus. If you have 3 acres of red beets in your garden and you have a few extra boxes that you want to get, or if you have 20 zucchini, there's days that you can take a few things to the auction. You're not necessarily a produce grower. When I broke it down with our local auction several years ago, they had a handful of growers, probably 6 or less, that were growing more than $100,000 per year. They probably had 300 growers that were between 25,000 and 100,000, and then they had 2,000 growers or 1,000 growers that were less than 5,000 in total sales. So there is kind of a whole range of size and scale to these growers. But we estimate that there's, and this is an estimation by the Food Safety Education Team, which I'll talk about in a little bit, they estimate there's about 25,000 small growers supplying these auction markets. And I would say that number of 25,000 is not entirely plain community growers. We have a lot of what we call English small growers, and just for definition, English to the Amish community is anyone who is not Amish. Has nothing to do with your ancestry. I have the same DNA as they do, but they consider me English because I'm not Amish. So anyway, that 25,000 number would contain some what we would call English growers, but they have these small growers have the same issues, the same challenges that the Amish growers, the Plain community growers would face. Pennsylvania, we have 16 auctions and at least 6 wholesale cooperatives or groups, and these things spring up every year. New auctions, new wholesale cooperatives. These folks are very, very entrepreneurial in trying to find markets for produce. They're not just satisfied to sell a few things at the end of the driveway. So they're always looking for some other opportunities, which gets them into GAP and gets them into FSMA. And we've concluded they make up somewhere between 60 and 70% of Pennsylvania's commercial produce growers. So they are not just a unique subset of our produce growing industry. They are the norm in most of our areas in Pennsylvania. Now, I wouldn't say they make up necessarily 60 to 70% of the volume. It might be more like 50% of the volume, but in terms of numbers of growers, they certainly are making up about 3/4 of our production in Pennsylvania. Next slide. So just some more demographics. There's over 300,000, and I get these numbers from Elizabethtown College. They have the Young Center for Anabaptist and Pietist Studies. They're probably the authority on Amish demographics and in general, and they estimate there's over 300,000 folks in North America, which we would consider plain sect. 31 different states: Ontario, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island in Canada. And you can see there Ohio and Pennsylvania kind of lead the way, followed by Indiana. They're the largest states in population, and then if you would go beyond that, you have New York, Wisconsin, Illinois. And they increase fairly rapidly, about 4,000. Their population goes up about 4,000 a year every year. You can see an increase of 8,000 since 2015. So what we, and this has been true for the past many years, 30, 40 years, I think they say the population doubles every 20 years. So we're finding more and more plain community vegetable growers in these states, not less. Next slide. So what are our main food safety issues that we address? And with these folks, it's no different than, some of these issues are no different than anyone else. Obviously, water testing comes to the top for obvious reasons, and you find that regardless of who you talk to, I think, and whatever scale you're working, water testing is an issue. Record keeping becomes a bit of a challenge for these growers simply because they are small. It's not something they can necessarily assign to someone else. A lot of their labor force, if it's not their family, it's the neighbors, it's someone else in the community, and they're probably part-time, so they can't necessarily assign that record keeping to someone else, so it becomes a burden on the grower, who's also the marketer and the guy in charge of production and buying supplies and all of that. So it has to fit in around everything else he's doing that day. So record keeping can be a challenge. Hand washing and hygiene, of course, comes up with every group. Couple of the things that are unique to this group is probably the use of horses in the field. FDA in their preamble to FSMA says they recognize traditional methods of farming, and they do not intend to discriminate against that in FSMA, although obviously there are practices that need to be added or managed if you're using work animals in the field. And then the other issue that comes up, again, related to animals, is how do you get your produce to the auction? How do you deliver produce to the auction? If you have a horse in the spring or summer that happens to be shedding and it's a damp, foggy morning, and you end up covering the wagon with horsehair by the time you get to the auction, that obviously can be a food safety issue. So there are a few unique things, challenges that they come up with, but they have a good handle on those, and often have some pretty good ideas on how to deal with those. So produce auctions in the rule itself, it says in the preamble, it says, and this is in the preventative controls, it says, to the extent that these operations are simply a location for buyers and sellers to meet and to sell and to transfer produce, and the food is not stored, FDA does not consider such facilities to be holding food and would not expect them to register with FDA. Therefore, these operations would not be regulated under FSMA. So the produce auction itself is not a facility by FDA's definition, and is not regulated under FSMA because it's merely it's in a lot of ways it's no different than the terminal markets. In fact, even less so. Terminal markets do hold produce at times. This is just a it's a means of marketing, and it's not necessarily a facility or anything that would be covered under FSMA. But having said that, there are obviously things we can do. You know, there are food safety risks, and there are things, standard operating procedures that can be done by the auctions, and this is a list that I put together with Benny Yoder, who's on the food safety education team, an Amish leader from Somerset County in Pennsylvania. And we put together kind of a list of things for growers who sell to auctions, but for auctions as well. And mostly the focus here is kind of on the auctions, just basic things like make sure you have a ceiling in the auction to prevent bird issues. You know, don't tie the horses by the auction building, put them across the parking lot somewhere where people aren't coming in and out of the auction buildings. No pets, you know, don't stand on carts, pallets, basic things that you would, standard operating procedures you would have for any packing shed, things like that. So we've put those together, and we often, in a lot of the auction meetings that I do, most of these auctions will have at least one meeting a year for their growers to come out and go over some policies, and we usually go over all of these kind of things at those kind of meetings. And so those are some of the standard operating procedures that we put together. If you want to list a copy of those, feel free to email me, and I can get those to you. Next slide. I want to talk a little bit about the food safety education team. This was started in 2011 or thereabouts. It goes back probably further than that for Raymond Yoder. Raymond is a former vegetable farmer and had a produce supply business in Ohio that reached actually throughout the Midwest through dealers. And he was one of those Amish leaders in the produce industry in the community. And early on, when the leafy greens agreement came about as part of the spinach outbreak back in the early 2000s, and there was talk about taking the California leafy greens nationwide, and there was concern in Ohio with along with the Ohio Department of Agriculture and some of the other farm leaders in Ohio. And this is back before FSMA came to be. So Raymond was involved in food safety early on, spoke directly with Mike Taylor, who was a deputy commissioner at that time, for putting FSMA together at FDA. And Raymond had a very good connection with Mike, and so Mike encouraged Raymond to get some help. Raymond said, we can educate the Plain community and do the outreach to that community, since they're a hard community to reach for the rest of us. And so Mike encouraged him to put together a committee. So Raymond came up with a group of 11 leaders, and their mission is to provide food safety training to the Plain community, and then to represent the Plain community to FDA, PSA. They were very involved, very vocal in the rulemaking process, and they published a couple booklets for the Plain community that I think Luke has a couple pictures of them later on, just kind of basic gaps in FSMA training. They also put together a record-keeping book that the auctions all sell and promote. And they've done literally, I said dozens, probably well over 100 GAPS meetings at these auctions. They divided up those 100 auctions among the 11 leaders, and they reached out to every one of those auctions to provide food safety training in the areas of general GAPS and in FSMA. Certainly, like all of us, we're not going to hit everybody. Some auctions were more inclined to respond. Others, you know, wanted to bury their head in the sand, just like any other farming community, but I would say probably 85 to 90% of those auctions have gotten involved with some kinds of gaps in FSMA training in the past 6 years. So when you go out and work with the Plain community, this gaps in FSMA training is not new to them. They've heard about it. Certainly if you give anybody a survey these days, nobody is going to say they know FSMA well. There are days I'm not sure I even know FSMA well, depending on the issues, and yeah, there's still a lot of questions at FDA and PSA around it. So, but these folks in general really understand, as well as anyone else that you work with, what's going on with food safety. I remember back in 2011, there was a listening session in Beltsville, Maryland, even before, it was probably 2010 because it was before FSMA was passed. There was 200 growers there at that listening session, and probably half of them at least were Plain community growers. So they've been involved in this. This is nothing really new. Just some Amish teaching tips, and this is always hard for me to kind of talk about because I've spent 30 years working with primarily Amish growers, and so I don't necessarily, they are normal to me. Everyone else sometimes seems strange. So I don't necessarily approach an Amish meeting differently than I approach a conventional meeting. Traditionally, I've worked in areas where I've taken a lot of the lead, as we mentioned earlier, from the community. That's the way we used to do extension years ago. You had advisory groups of farmers in the community, and they tended to drive the programming. Not so much anymore in our era of technology. But yeah, the Amish, just some quick tips. They speak plainly, they're be honest. You do need to be aware of their dress. I guess this is the one issue that does come up at times. They don't like shorts. All summer long I wear jeans. Appropriate humor, again, you know, that's common sense. I've had a lot of people ask me over the years how Amish relate to women or you know, folks outside of their norm, and I would say that is not an issue, at least for folks who don't make it one. I've worked with a lot of university folks who I've had to meetings in Lancaster County, folks that I think of like Kathy Demchek, Beth Gugino, who are well respected and sought after by our Plain community. If I don't have some of those folks at our meetings, they ask me where they are. So I don't think gender or race is generally an issue. They like to work with people who seem to know what they're doing, who respect them, just like any other community that you're working with. Tend to focus on problem solving. They want to figure out the solutions. They don't want to know what the problem, well, when they hear a problem, they don't want to hear how bad it is. They want to know how they can fix it and move on. So they're interested in food safety, but they're more focused on what can we do to make this work. And then the other thing I've found over the years is respect their knowledge. They have a tremendous amount of knowledge. I have learned as much from them, I think, as I have ever taught them on just about any area that I've tried to teach them on. So I found that I tell them I take the information I learned from one farm and take it to the next farm. They do have a tremendous amount of knowledge, particularly in production and equipment, and increasingly on food safety. We have been in situations with the food safety education team where they've been in the situation of having to train state food safety inspectors and folks on FSMA and on farming and on basic gaps. There's been issues that have come up over the years where they have found that even the folks and the regulators at times have needed their knowledge. So those are just some basic tips. I'm sure those of you who have worked with the Amish over the years could expound on that even more. Okay, next slide.
I'll take this, Jeff.
Okay. Yep.
This does get back to the grant project that we're working on. We put this proposal in before the final produce safety rule was issued and before the PSA curriculum came out. So we're learning a lot about what we can and can't do and what we want to, what's practical. But we did title Develop an Alternative FSMA Compliant Produce Safety Curriculum. We don't use that word anymore. We are going to use the PSA curriculum, but present it in a different mode. And these definitions have come up over time. And so we're trying to fold our way right into this, into the usual way of doing things to get people through this curriculum, and especially this percentage of Amish and Plain Sect who want a low technology alternative. So we were to develop a modified, and we don't use that word either anymore, produce safety curriculum. We're going to pilot it, compare it to the traditional, what we call traditional PowerPoint one, and then disseminate the materials we develop to other states, to extension educators and others in other states, so they can deliver this and get people certified. So just briefly, some of the work we've done today, we did a literature review. We reviewed PSA curriculum materials. We have, and particularly Jeff has talked with the food safety education team for some initial discussions of curricular delivery options, and we'll show that in a little bit. And we also had a conference call with PSA that we're going to follow up on regarding curriculum change requirements and some technical issues about, well, how do you take a PowerPoint slide and present that in a paper form or readable form. So we have developed some prototypes of slides, and I should say right now, when we're not proposing or planning on replacing the grower manual. That would be issued to everybody, a part of the workshop. It's the challenge is how do you present the slides that accompany that grower manual. But the grower manual is an important reference for them to have. We're going to develop an evaluation tool, get that IRB done, and work with the different groups here on acceptability materials and formats. We're going to look at some supplementary materials that, again, emphasizing FSMA, harvester handler booklets, get approval, consent for all these materials, and then start to, we hope to do some pilot training in the winter of 2018. This is what Jeff mentioned. This is the existing Amish food safety team materials. It's a booklet they put out. It's very, very nicely done and has some good tips. We don't want to replace this. We respect this, and this is a great thing that they should have. We're going to, and this is a good thing to pass out to people as well. So that's another resource. So I'll just briefly start with some initial concepts for the certification, low technology certification training. Jeff, why don't you go over some of this process we've gone through with the different approaches and considering each one and where we're at.
Okay. Yeah, there are a number of groups. Certainly, I would say the majority of the Plain Sect, probably 75%, would have no problem coming to an extension office or to a meeting and watching a PowerPoint presentation. But there are groups, there are some subgroups who don't like to see PowerPoint presentations. They would rather have those meetings be a little more low tech. In addition to that, there's just a number of times that I have found that growers want me to come to their venue to do a meeting. Not that they can't or won't come to mine, but it's easier for them to organize it and do it at their auction or to do it in somebody's home in the basement. and many times in those situations I find that I don't have power. So we tried to come think outside the box. What are some low-tech approaches we could use? We've talked about flip charts up front. Inevitably that's hard for people to see. If you get a big crowd, scrolling displays like you see there on the right that would kind of scroll and kind of show the slides, they got very expensive and they can't be changed or modified very much when changes come to the regulation. So and flip charts, if we had large flip charts, would become a a mess to they're not very portable, so we didn't want to have to rent a truck to move our presentation from place to place. So we looked at all those things, and kind of what we came down to, and this was partly the suggestion of the food safety education team. They said, what if we had like a personalized flip chart? Think of it as a 3-ring binder that you would mount on that you could set on the table in front of you that had the slides in it. So we're thinking 2 slides to a page, kind of like the thing you see there, although probably rather instead of that spiral binder, it would probably be more of a 3-ring binder so that we could make changes to it over time. But something that you would prop up on the table in front of you that the speaker would go through. It would have the slides on it just like a PowerPoint would, but the growers would flip the page as you went from one to the next. So it would look something like this, and this is kind of what we're showing. Although this one has the holes in the center, you would actually probably have the holes in the top. And this, they said they would rather have people looking up at something in front of them rather than looking down at a notebook on their table, which from a presentation standpoint is a good idea. The idea was that these would not be something that the growers would take home. Rather, this is something that the presenter would collect, probably 35 to 40 of them per training, and you would box them up and take them to the next training, so they would be reused at multiple trainings. It wouldn't be a once and done kind of thing. So what we've done is taking these slides that you're seeing here, are the basic, essentially the slides from the PowerPoints, and just putting them on pages and using them that way. We have to be a little conscious of the pictures and the resolution as you start to to expand them on the page, as how clear they are. We've also looked at doing it in black and white. One of the things I should mention that the food safety education team has talked about is, we've gone through this whole issue of who's exempt and who's not exempt, and who's qualified exempt and who's not. And their recommendation for the Amish community, the Plain community, is that everyone go through the FSMA training. So I would anticipate that I wouldn't spend a lot of time trying to figure out who is exempt and who's not. These folks have encouraged everyone to go through it. They just feel that would be simpler than trying to figure out who is exempt and who's not. They want everybody to have GAPS training anyway, and the FSMA training is a pretty good GAPS program. So their recommendation that they're giving to the auctions is that over the next number of years that all of their growers have a FSMA training. So if you think about that in terms of those 25,000 small growers, if we had to train 15,000 of them, and we do 40 or 50 in a meeting, you start doing the math, it comes out to a lot of meetings. So this is the model that they, the method, I guess, that they are the most comfortable with. So I think that's going to be the focus of what we do here in this project.
I'll just add that we do not intend to change a single word that's in the Produce Safety Alliance curriculum, just to make this whole process easier, and it's just fine as it is. It's just the mode of delivery. And I'll also add one more issue here, is that I read the requirements for training, and the harvesters and handlers need training as well. So one thing we're looking at is a take-home booklet that could be training. Here's something that was developed for worker protection training, revised from a US EPA book. This is one way to present materials to take home. We have some already developed products such as the Flipchart that people really like. Primarily that had the Spanish-speaking audience in mind in addition to English-speaking. And so we're looking at modifying that to look at some of the issues that are specific. Also posters that again were developed for English and Spanish speakers. What can we do for plain text? Jeff, do you have anything to add, or should we go to comments, questions, and experiences?
No, I think we can go to questions and experiences. I'm sure a lot of the folks have had a lot of experience working with this community as well, and it'd be good to hear some other folks' input on that.
Great. So actually, let me just tell everybody that you are unmuted on the larger scale. So if you would like to comment, you have to unmute yourself on your personal computer or on your cell phone or your phone to speak up. But or if you, for some reason, don't have audio, you can type into the chat box and we can read your comment out loud. But this is an open discussion time, so please feel free to jump in with some thoughts or questions or comments for Jeff and Luke.
This is Patrick Byers from the University of Missouri. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you sound great.
Yes.
Thank you. I've been working with plain sect farmers in Webster County here in Missouri, and one question that comes up in our food safety, we've been doing primarily gaps-related trainings. We really haven't used the FSMA curriculum approach yet, but one question that comes up is oftentimes they need to use wagons for multiple purposes, including livestock, and oftentimes these wagons have wooden boxes, and I've heard some interesting suggestions on how to deal with the issue of disinfecting that kind of a setting, but I'm curious what the team might have to comment on that.
Well, the growers I've worked with a lot have used wooden wagons. Typically, we encourage them to put things on. I mean, obviously, we try to keep the wagon as clean as possible, and before you start, most of our wagons are used for hay, bringing in tobacco, those kind of things. So they clean them off, but mostly produce that gets transported on those is usually in bins. We encourage folks to, to keep that in bins or in boxes up on pallets to try and, avoid that kind of contact. I think when you get into livestock, that's, if it's something that they're actually hauling animals around on, then it becomes, more of a challenge, I think, in that situation. Luke, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that the issue of wood containers is always coming up, and I think the general advice for anyone is that keep them clean and keep them dry. Water is the enemy. It's not easy to clean and sanitize those kind of containers, but I don't think they're going to go away anytime soon. So we would give our best advice is just, keeping them dry and protected as well as they're stored.
Great. Are there other comments or questions or points of discussion that folks would like to add?
This is Lindsay in Pennsylvania. Hi, Jeff. Hi, Luke. I've been instructing people or advising people to use what I'm calling the sacrificial bin. So if you have a wooden wagon that where they've been hauling animals, you could, of course, clean it first and then, and if possible, let it dry, and then put down a layer of bins that you put bins into. Same thing with harvesting. When you take it out into the field, you can use a sacrificial bin underneath the bin that you're actually harvesting into, and then you clean and sanitize those bins. If they're using plastic, of course, with wood you can't sanitize.
Right.
Well, to follow up on that, one of the farmers proposed using a tarp, a plastic-based tarp that they could lay down in the bed of the wagon, and then the tarp would be what they would clean and sanitize. So again, I'd like some thoughts on that too, please.
Yeah, I mean, go ahead, Luke.
Is that tarp in the container, or say again? I'm sorry.
The tarp would be lining the bed of the trailer or the wagon.
Have you ever seen that, Jeff?
No, I remember having that discussion probably in a group where they asked if that would be you know, something acceptable, and that's certainly you know, certainly something you'd want to try. I mean, that would be another barrier, especially one that could be cleaned and sanitized. So I think on the risk scale, you know, when we do the FSMA training, we always have the high risk, you know, low risk, and you have that scale. That that's certainly something that would fit in there, you know, to reduce that risk. I mean, ultimately, the best thing you can do is to have a wagon that's not going to be impacted by animals, and you know, have it dedicated for produce and crops. But certainly, yeah, a plastic tarp, and we've even talked about doing that with bins that are you know, recycled bins. If you absolutely have to reuse a cardboard bin or a wooden bin, you know, a plastic liner could work in those situations as well. So anything like that they can come up with, you know, that shows that they're making an effort to reduce the, you know, the risk of contamination, I think would certainly be good.
I wonder if we have any USDA AMS GAP auditors on here and what they would think about reusing paper or cardboard bins, or protecting food from wagons, directly contacting the wagon itself.
Right. Did I see Brenda Schaefer on here? Is she still on? Maybe she'd have some thoughts on that, or Christine. Maybe they're not on anymore.
Yeah, I see that both Brenda and Christine are on the call. I'm not sure they are. Brenda, you are unmuted if you, and so is Christine if you wanted to provide comment.
They're on the spot.
Yeah.
Maybe not. Well, we do have a question in the chat box, which I wanted to not miss. Lori George wants to know, where can she get a copy of the publication Farm Food Safety Plan Volume 2 that you showed on the previous slide, and was this developed for the Amish community?
So yes, that this was actually developed by the food safety education team by Raymond Yoder. Also, Don Steckel, I think from PSA, had some input into it, as well as John Mast, who's an auditor, a GAPS auditor out in Ohio. They are available for $5 from Yoder's Produce Supply. There's also, as I mentioned, he has a lot of dealers around the country that sell produce supplies, and they have these books available as well. That probably doesn't help you a lot. If you would email me your name and address, I can try and see that you get one. So yeah, it's yeah, we do have some, but you'd almost have to talk to the find a Plain community and a produce supply house. It was geared primarily for those growers, but I'd be glad to help someone get one.
That illustrates some of the challenges with you know, this isn't going to be on Amazon.
Right.
So how do they, I mean, they have their own distribution network. So again, contact Jeff or another member of that team, and maybe something we can do is establish those connections. So if you have questions, you can go directly to them.
Yeah. And and if you're working in, I mean, the members of that team are scattered throughout Pennsylvania. On the Midwest, we have folks on there from Missouri, Kentucky, Wisconsin, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Indiana. So it is a group that does try to represent the entire community, and they do have a very good network amongst themselves, probably a better database and network than we could ever have. But it is a little hard for the rest of us to sometimes tap into that.
Great, thanks. And Chris provided Jeff's email address in the chat box for folks who want to reach out to him. And along that same thread, I'm wondering, can you guys speak to your timeline for, it sounds like you've landed on the individual desk-based flip charts, and you had talked about how you would have a set that you would, you would use it and then pick it up and take it back with you. What is within the project that you have, your printing goals and timeline and distribution? Is this something that you guys will then have the template for, and if folks across the country want to do this, they need to produce them themselves? How is that plan to be worked out, or are you still thinking about that?
We're having discussions with PSA on how we're going to do this, who's going to manage that, and how we're going to distribute that. I think we would send out copies of our original sets to interested people, depending on our budget, and also make it available online on a website. But I think we're going to, we hope, okay, we're waiting for, Betsy said that there's going to be a volume 2 of the grower safety manual and therefore the slides. And so, again, we wait for FDA to come up with the latest. We don't want to work with volume 1 slides knowing that volume 2 might be different in some ways. But we hope to start doing some prototyping on this in the late fall and early winter, and then get that out as quickly as possible. But again, these guys, many of them are in the small category. We hope to finish this next year, have all our results and all that out, and start to disseminate the material. I'm going to try to meet the needs as the compliance dates come in.
Okay, Jeff, can you hear me? This is Brenda Schaefer calling
Yes.
in.
Yep.
Finally. We just got new computers, and I could not find a way to connect to you to talk. I kept on muting, and nothing was working. Okay. You were asking about the tarps on wagons?
Yes.
Okay. We would probably have to look at it on a case-by-case basis, and we would be looking to make sure that the product is sufficiently protected from the anything that might be left on the wagon, and the cleanliness of the tarp, and what is the process to keep the tarp clean. Because obviously if you're laying that tarp down on a dirty surface, then you're going to want to make sure that that tarp isn't flipped over and used again. Perhaps a better way might be to use a disposable liner that is a one-time use, so you don't have to worry about the chance of contamination.
Yeah.
So does that answer that question a little better? Yeah,
that's good. I mean, that's kind of the thinking you would go through in looking at that. And Brenda Schaefer, by the way, is auditor with the Pennsylvania Department of Ag, USDA, does the USDA GAP, GIP, and harmonized audits. And so yeah, it's always good to know at least how you would think through some of those things. And that's kind of what we do when we talk to growers, because when a lot of these issues, you're just helping them do a risk assessment, essentially, of a risky area. And so you kind of talk them through, what would work, and they often come up with some pretty good ideas. And I have seen guys build wagons. Some of them are actually graded so that the water, if they, for example, have to wash something off, the water runs through the, doesn't trap anything on the wagon bed itself. It may be graded. They use those for sweet corn. They've also, I've seen guys put plastic floors down on wagons so that they can clean and sanitize them. So if you talk through that whole risk assessment with the growers, it is amazing what they come up with. They're pretty inventive and can readily change things like that. So, yep. Thanks, Brenda.
You're welcome. Now, I have a question also. Okay. I'm wondering where a lot of these growers that are more than the 25,000 are going to fall into, as far as whether they fall under a qualified exemption, because the auction serves as a hub. So where the product ends up at is kind of unknown. So it may be more than that 275 miles, or it may be further than, you know, in other states. So I'm wondering where your thoughts are as to whether they are going to fall under the qualified exemption or not.
Well, yeah, and that's part of the complications, I think, of that exemption. The one thing, you know, we've always said the auctions have very good traceability. The buyers, when they buy the produce, get a list of who they bought from, and the buyers, when they get their check, get a list of who they sold to. So they can tell, most of the farmers know the buyers, they know, you know, where the stores are located, but some of them may be wholesale buyers. I would say probably 75 to 80% of the buyers are what we would call qualified end users, but there are those, you know, wholesalers. Most of the produce, again, stays within 200 miles or 250 miles, but again, you have to know there are days that we get buyers from pretty far away. It will complicate things, and I think that's one of the reasons the food safety education team has just said, you know what, let's just have everybody go through the training. It's hardly worth the effort to determine whether or not you're qualified exempt or not. And so I think the auctions would rather they had some gap training anyway, and so I think they will probably push just to have everybody you know, go through that and not apply for the exemption. That'll be my expectation, but of course that'll vary from farmer to farmer and auction to auction. Many of the auctions are very small, much smaller than the ones we have here in Lancaster County, and for those, you know, types of auctions, you know, it's unusual that a buyer would be, you know, further than 200 miles away. But certainly for some of the bigger auctions, that does happen from time to time.
Okay, all right, thank you. And I have one other question. I saw that you had hand sanitizers on the list for the auction houses for an SOP, the use of hand sanitizer.
Yeah, yeah, that's, and yeah, we all, yeah, and that's certainly not a replacement for hand washing. That's one of the things we do try and remind them of, and we certainly expect that they all have bathrooms with, you know, soap and sinks and single-use towels. They just put that out there, I guess, you know, for the auction floor, so that you know, I guess when folks are out there, they do have another chance to protect themselves. But yeah, it's certainly not a replacement for soap and water.
Okay, and then I got one. Now you're going to probably wish I didn't have the microphone, but I got one other comment, and I'm going to ask. I'm wondering, did you guys consider using like a generator, like a little Honda 2000 generator, which are quiet, for the PowerPoint? I know you said a lot of people are object to the use of the tools, but that would make it much more portable for you to even do at a farm. Yeah,
and I've done that. I've used generators. I've even used inverters off of you know, like a car battery to run slides, and yeah, that does work. There are still a few groups that just don't like the idea of PowerPoints. And so that's kind of was the thinking behind it. But yeah, I have used generators in some situations, and that does work for a number of them. But it would still miss those couple of farms, and it's really not, you know, I guess it gets back to the point, it's not necessarily a large number of Amish growers that would need to have these flip charts. Like I said, a lot of them still are, are not that uncomfortable with PowerPoints that they, wouldn't be able to do that. But there are, you will, depending on the area that you're into, the region that you're into, the Belleville community probably in Pennsylvania, that would not be comfortable with slides and PowerPoints. So that's kind of been our strategy. And we have had challenges already with equipment. Sometimes the power that you get off of a generator or a battery inverter is not always as steady as what it is out of the outlets, and then that can damage equipment. So that's the other issue that sometimes we run into.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jeff. That was all my questions.
Thanks, Brenda.
This is Patrick Byers again. Another question that has come up in our trainings. We have very interesting discussions on animal incursion into produce fields. And as I work with the plain farmers, it seems like horses tend to be one of the animals that they have some issues with. But I'm curious if you have any guidelines or suggestions on the sort of the buffer area around a poop incident related to horses.
Yeah, so this is always an interesting and lively discussion. One of the things that we recommend, the food safety team recommends, and I think it's in their booklet, they recommend a drive row, a grassed drive row, 10 foot wide, so that when we're out there spraying or harvesting and pulling wagons, that the horses would stay, on that drive row. That doesn't always work if some folks have to cultivate. Obviously, then they have to go through the field. And as far as what do you do when you have horse manure in the field, we've talked about taking it out of the field, disposing of it that way, with a shovel. But then do we risk more cross-contamination by carrying that through the field? So typically, yeah, and I don't know, and again, a lot of this will depend on the crop. If it's a low-growing crop, obviously you'd want to have, spinach or lettuce, things like that. They don't grow a lot of that in fields, but, those kind of crops, you'd want to have a greater setback than what you did if you were growing a more upright crop. So the minimum I've always said is 3 feet, but there are times when I would say if you had a low-growing crop, I would go higher than that. I don't know if there's any, Luke, is there any research on how far away we can impact produce? I know I've heard as much as 10 or 15 feet.
What an interesting research project.
Yeah.
No, I don't know if anyone's come up with exact, it depends, is it raining? Is there possibility for runoff or splash? Lots of factors, as usual, in these kind of risk assessments.
Right.
And actually, I do know, I'll add to that, based on the conversation at the Soil Summit that was held in Geneva a couple of months ago, they talked about some of the research that was going on, and that was one of the topics that FDA has commissioned some work to be done, are those exact questions.
Great.
Thank you. That was great.
Are there other comments or questions from the group?
This is Chris. Luke and Jeff, thanks so much for that presentation. That was really, really well done. Thanks. Luke, I had one question about the data you presented on self-review of comfort level with the FSMA produce safety rule. And I was wondering whether the FSMA grower training course participants, whether the survey that was delivered prior to the course, correct?
Yes, before the course started.
Thanks.
There was also some guidance trying to define what food is, what produce is, and so it was kind of interactive. But no, they had not gone through the course yet.
Great, thanks.
I think that would be, I wonder if that's a question in the Produce Safety Alliance evaluation, that could be teased out to see if they feel more comfortable now knowing the regulations. I would assume so.
I would think, yep.
Great. Other questions or comments?
Hi, I'm calling from California, and I work with a lot of farmers that do not use sort of normal technologies such as, you know, cell phones or computers regularly. I'm wondering if someone could comment about like the challenges of working with people that aren't really technologically familiar and sort of how to overcome those, whether it's with updates to FSMA, things like that, systems for food safety.
Yeah, so one of the things that we found with our plain communities that I guess we kind of have taken for granted, and we do, we have a lady here in our extension office that does a lot of general farm safety with the plain communities, particularly with children. But one of the things that she's noticed is that this community loves to read much more than what the rest of us do that I guess spend time on the internet or on computer games or streaming videos or whatever my kids do. But this community tends to read a lot more. They respond much better to printed material. Even kids, they send safety information home with kids from schools, from the one-room schools. We used to publicize meetings in my previous job with the school district. We would go around to one-room schools and send the flyers home with the kids, and that way it got back to the parents. So we found that was a good way to hit the community because they do spend a lot of time reading, and just even one-page, two-page newsletters, booklets, anything like that, you know, works real well in that community. It's just kind of going back 50 years, I guess, in terms of our thinking of how we get information out and how we used to do that. And, you know, and for me, farm visits, I found these folks, even on a cold call, to be very, generally very welcoming. So if I, you know, am thinking about a program, I can go into a, you know, community. It helps if you know a few folks in the community that you can go and talk to and say, you know, what would be a really good way to get this information out. Look at the places where they gather a lot. We use the produce auctions a lot for that. In Pennsylvania, Penn State has put up information kiosks in the produce auctions as a way to distribute fact sheets and flyers and to post, you know, posters and information. The supply houses where they pick up their produce supplies, the seeds, the plastic, pesticides. That's a good place to, you know, to pass out information as well. So yeah, you kind of have to find those places where folks gather, where they frequent very often, and that's a good place to pass out information. And I find just going to the produce auctions, engaging folks in conversation, it's the produce auctions, in addition to providing a marketing function, also provide a bit of an educational function in the community as well. Farmers go there, they ask their neighbors what they're seeing on their crops. You know, when I go there, I'm answering a lot of questions all the time. People will walk up to you and start asking questions. So those kind of informal places are a good way to disseminate information.
I think also in the broader sense, we see a lot of, especially in the water issues, some high-tech apps and, you know, ways to upload data and all this stuff. And, you know, just stepping back and thinking, well, how can someone keep track of their water samples and statistical threshold values and geometric means and all this kind of stuff? That's an interesting challenge that not everybody is going to have access to this, you know, quick and easy ways to do that. And that's going to be interesting. And maybe there's some options for extension or other sort of hub groups to assist in gathering and sorting and calculating and interpreting data for groups, so that not everyone has to, you know, get out and do these complex mathematical equations. And again, I think FDA is recognizing this now, and we'll see what happens in a few months if they're going to reconsider some of that. But it's always interesting to step back and think, how can I deliver something that's, you know, more face-to-face? And I think one thing you might consider is that these materials can be used for other audiences And it's like old-fashioned training where you're not relying on the PowerPoint. And we're going to try to observe this in our pilot. That's what is the interaction between the instructor and the audience when you're stepping away from a computer screen that you've gotten so used to, or a PowerPoint screen, and you're right up there with them following along in the printed material. I think it'll be very interesting to observe that.
Great, thanks so much. So we've got just a couple minutes left before we've reached the hour and a half. If there's any last minute questions before we close out or comments. And I know that if you have follow-up questions later on or wanted to get access to some of this information, Chris put both of the email addresses for Luke and Jeff in the chat box, so you have those. And this recording will be posted on the webinar, on the NECAF's website, so you can go and reference it later too if you would like. So with that, I guess we'll close out for the day, and thank you so much to Jeff and Luke for this really interesting and informative presentation, and thanks everybody for joining, and have a great afternoon.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.